Hello and welcome to The Things You Thought You Knew, the A-Level Philosophy podcast. I am your host, Ryan Liddell, and today I'm joined by Daniel McCrea. Hello, Dan.
Hi, Ryan. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Yep, still standing. Strange times with the COVID, so we're all doing
our
best.
Yeah, no, it really is. So firstly, Dan, do you want to quickly talk about how you got into philosophy or your connection to the subject?
Yeah, sure. So, how did I first get involved in philosophy was through my English teacher. Philosophy was something that was, absolutely alien to students in Ireland. We didn't have philosophy at the A level. But my English teacher said, "Gosh, you really do like getting into arguments, don't you?" And I had to agree with him. And he said, you should take all of that argumentative energy and that intellect and try and channel it into something. And so he said, have you ever thought of studying philosophy at university? I got my first introduction to philosophy book, and then, a degree and a master's and an ill-fated PhD later. I just fell in love with it.
Yeah. So what do you do at the moment?
So my day job, my one that pays the bills, I work in educational technology. More specifically, I work in developing machine learning educational applications. So that's cool. Artificial intelligence, that type of thing, which is a lot of fun and does pay the bills. But my kind of passion is still philosophy. So I run a website called myshortcourse.com, and that collects resources from teachers and from various different parts of the internet to support the teaching of philosophy in Ireland for the short course, which is quite different from the A level, but it's close enough that I think we can have an interesting conversation.
I'll make sure to link my short course in the bio so anyone who's interested can check it out. Fantastic. Is that for teachers or for students?
It's for both, predominantly for teachers or eager beaver students.
That's great, okay. So first thing we're going to get into today is we're going to be talking about the philosophical method. So do you want to quickly break down what the philosophical method is? Yeah,
sure. So one of the funny things you'll notice about philosophers is that they never get into anything directly before a lot of preamble. So this is, and the reason, that's not by accident. We try and be very careful with the words that we choose, even when we're doing kind of informal podcasts like this. So the philosophical method is, well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what philosophy is. So philosophy, etymologically speaking, is the love of knowledge. So philosophia, why would you love knowledge? Why is knowledge important? Philosophers believe that truth is not only intrinsically good, but it's a good as a means to greater happiness. Now, the problem is that it turns out we're not particularly adept at discovering the truth. So most of us take what we're told at face value. We're believing animals for the most part, and evolutionarily speaking, that's worked in our favor. And we generally take things at face value and don't tend to explore them too much more deeply. And that can get us into problems. So look, if you don't learn how to critically analyze arguments or push people to explain why they believe certain things, at worst, you'll be kind of a sucker for common knowledge, and a lot of common knowledge is stupidity. And at worst, you'll be, an easy stooge for the exploitation of others. So philosophy is very much concerned with careful argumentation. As a methodology, it seeks to break down great claims into smaller, more manageable arguments that you can then dispute or call into question and try and evolve in a dialectic way. So bringing forward ideas through conversation and through careful argumentation is really what the philosophical method is all about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's where the name of the podcast comes from. It's called The Things You Thought You Knew because we assume things about the world without really thinking about why we assume that. And that's where the name comes from.
Yeah, no, I was saying to you, I absolutely love the name. It's perfect. So people generally would not call into question things like, how can we be sure that we know something? It just seems so obvious. But, it's it's the people who are prepared to ask strange questions that are the ones who move things forward. So if you think historically, at some stage or another, Ryan, somebody said, should we really be treating black people like this? Is this definitely the best way of doing things? Don't they also have rights? So those types of radical questions of what is taken at face value to be very obviously true at the time is the type of work that philosophers do. And that's why I love the name of the podcast. It takes somebody who's a little bit quirky and a little bit kind of crazy to ask the big questions. And then, sometimes you might, strike gold and get a big answer.
100% agree with that, but also the little things. Like one of my favourite questions to ask my non-philosopher friends is, can you prove to me that other people have minds? And they can never give an argument for why other people have minds. Then I go get them to research arguments for and against it, and I think it's really interesting because the world as you perceive it might not be how the world is, but most people don't really consider that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of line of questioning and really a deeply philosophical question. One of the things that I think philosophers generally are very poor at is articulating the consequences of philosophical ideas. So it's quite easy with a lot of philosophical questions, it's quite easy to be dismissive about them and go, well, look, who really gives a damn whether or not you can prove if other minds exist? I can still get up in the morning, I can still go to work and buy myself a car and have friends. So a lot of it can come across as kind of abstract posturing. I think philosophers, as a general rule, could do a lot better at explaining the consequences of these ideas. But look, that's another conversation for another podcast.
Yeah. 100% agree, but let's not get into that today. So the actual philosophical method itself, 5 stages. Should we go through them stage by stage, or?
Well, do you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, okay. So philosophical method that I've got, the first thing to take in mind is while we're doing that, we want to be clear about the vocabulary. As you were saying earlier, wording is very important in philosophy, especially words like all or every, because when you say something like that, you're making a generalized statement. So you don't want to say all people do this, because then you're literally saying all people do this, and it's very easy to have someone counter that argument by saying one person doesn't, so your argument's wrong. So it's important when doing a philosophical argument to be very careful with your vocabulary.
Yeah.
So the first stage of the philosophical method is to make sure that the question or issue is clearly stated and understood. And that again links into the vocabulary. So for example, we'll go down the concept of God. So for this topic, an example of stage 1 would be to ask, is the concept of God coherent? And that's the question or issue you're trying to dig into with the philosophical method.
Yeah.
So then stage 2 would be to be clear about what the possible claims are that could be put forward to as answers to the question. So for is the concept of God coherent, there's 4. There's yes, it is coherent, no, it's not coherent, yes, it is coherent as long as you understand it in a particular way, or we cannot know whether it's coherent or not. So you start by asking the question, then you look at all the possible answers, and then stage 3 is you set out a clear argument that can be given for or against one of the claims. So you choose one of the claims in stage 2 and you want to make a proper argument about it. Then stage 4 would be to consider any objections someone could have to that claim. So if I was to make a claim about the coherence of the concept of God and whether it's coherent or not, stage 4 is stage 3 is you make your argument, and then stage 4 is you want to consider any arguments people might make against you.
Yeah, and just in stage 4, so one of the more kind of nuanced points that doesn't come out sometimes in stage 4 is the role of empathy in philosophy. So the ability to put yourself in another person, and often your opponents or interlocutors' shoes, and try not to do them a disservice. So there's a concept of straw man, which is you try and present your opponent's ideas in the most kind of flimsy and weak and pathetic way. So that's quite a disingenuous way to execute stage 4. So stage 4 is really about what you might call intellectual integrity and empathy. And I think that is one of the things that maybe distinguishes philosophy from debating. Debating has as its primary goal winning, right? So you want to win a debate. when you enter into philosophy in kind of good faith, what you're really trying to do is you're both on a joint project to discover the truth. I mean, ideally, that's what philosophy is kind of aimed at. So that's one way in which, empathy is required to identify your opponent's positions, but you also have a kind of an obligation to represent your opponent's views as best as you possibly can. And that's the only way you can really make progress in a philosophical inquiry. If you want to win a debate, you can straw man and you can use rhetoric and you can just dump on author ideas, you can attack them personally, you can do whatever you want to win the game. But the game of philosophy is really the game of truth.
No, I really agree with that. I like the way you've said that, because again, in philosophy, it's about learning the truth, and attacking your opponent might make you win the argument, but you're doing them a disservice and yourself a disservice, because you're not finding out the truth anymore.
You're just playing a game. Yeah.
Yeah. At the end of the day, a nice way that I've heard of putting it is, if you lose a philosophical debate, you should thank your opponent because you've learned something new. So you haven't really lost; you've won because you've both learned something.
Look, Ryan, absolutely on paper and on this podcast, I'm going to agree with that wholeheartely. In reality, emotions get in the way and it's a lot tougher. But yeah, no, I agree. In principle, I agree completely.
Unfortunately, I do agree that sometimes you can get wound up in your arguments, but at the end of the day, I'd rather know the truth than to die standing on my hill.
Yeah, well put. So, just to bring out that idea on stage 4, and you were going to round us off there with stage 5?
Yep, so stage 5 is then deciding whether you think the argument or the objection succeeds and for what reason. So basically you're looking at stage 3, your argument, stage 4, the objections, and just kind of trying to decide what your final outcome is. So stage 3 and 4 can go back and forth a bit with counter arguments, and then stage 5 is deciding what you think the conclusion would be.
Excellent.
So
and so why on earth did we come up with this extraordinarily complicated 5-stage process for trying to discover something that's true? Precisely because we're so poor at being clear, and we're so poor at discovering the truth. And that's why, a methodology was required in the first place to help us clarify these things, because so often, we got ourselves tangled up, and still do, but less so with this kind of rule book for developing your ideas and coming up with concrete arguments.
Yeah, I mean, even outside of philosophy, I could probably lose track of how many times I've had an argument with somebody, and then we realised at the end the reason we had the argument was because we misunderstood the terminology we were using. So I think the nice thing about the philosophical method is that you have to be clear with your opponent, that you understand what you mean by certain terms. So you're not going to have an argument when the only reason you're arguing is because you've both misunderstood something.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. That there's a lot of segues there with philosophy of language, which I don't think is on the A-level course. So A-level has epistemology, moral philosophy, metaphysics of God, and metaphysics of mind, broadly speaking, right?
Yeah, those are the 4 subtopics that we cover.
Okay, very good. Yeah. So philosophy of language is all about, look, are we sure we're not just going around in nonsensical circles here? Which is, unnerving to say the least. Anyway.
We have briefly touched on some philosophy of language, especially when we're at moral philosophy. We've been looking at language there, but it's not like a major thing. Okay,
interesting, yeah. I guess another thing to say would be one of the, when you're talking about, what is philosophy and the philosophical method, where did it all start? Plato has Socrates say, look, philosophy begins in wonder. So why have we got this method? Because we look at the world and we experience a sense of wonder or excitement about discovering something new, and this method is going to get us closer to the truth, and the truth is valuable in and of itself, and it's also valuable because it can improve our chances of living a good life, however you construe that, which is great and all, right? But there's a philosopher, and I think this is a good kind of entry point into our discussion, our specific topic today, which is God. There's a philosopher called Simon Critchley, a living philosopher, who puts it really beautifully. He says, look, there are two forms of disappointment. It's not wonder, it's disappointment that informs philosophy. People become philosophical for two specific disappointing reasons. The first is religious disappointment, which kind of arises from a lack of faith and raises the question, look, what is the meaning of life in the face of a lack of an ultimate meaning from God? So religious disappointment is the first thing. And then political disappointment. So we look at the world and political disappointment is something that people are experiencing in abundance right now with the Black Lives Matter movements and other political concerns in the States. But you look at the world and you go, this is so disappointing. How on earth did we get here? And that's the beginning of this kind of philosophical journey and methodology and inquiry.
Right, yeah, no, I've not heard of that philosopher before, but I agree with what he's saying, to be honest. That does make sense. I guess when you don't believe in a God and you want to know what the meaning of life is, philosophy is a really good way to kind of start thinking about that. Exactly,
and that's, it very much this kind of disappointment, the religious kind of disappointment that got me interested in philosophy in the beginning. So it's kind of appropriate that I should be here talking about philosophy, religion, God, here on a Monday evening on a sunny June, 30 years later, yeah.
I mean, it's worth pointing out quickly is that we're discussing the concept of God, and the A-level course only looks at a monotheistic idea of God.
Yeah.
We don't at all start to look at polytheistic religion, and I've done a little bit of reading outside of the curriculum on how philosophers tackle polytheistic religions.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting, but it's not something we discuss in the course, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one. Look, let's practice what we preach here about being clear. So the topic of this podcast is nominally the attributes of God, and then some arguments around the attributes and responses to them. But really what we're talking about here is, two specific books, the Old Testament writings and the New Testament writings, combined with commentary through the centuries leading up until now. And really, before you can talk about the attributes of God, you have to just acknowledge, look, this is a very circumscribed and small take on what God is and how God operates. Different people are going to disagree on what the key texts are. I mean, how seriously you take Muhammad, Martin Luther. So depending on how seriously you take these subsequent prophets, will inform what literature you listen to. And of course, there's a whole volume of religious belief going perhaps all the way back to 2600 BCE, which is the kind of Kesh Temple hymn. So that is 1300 years before the Old Testament writings even began. So what the A-level does well is, I think, it gives you a nice slice of the canon, and the canon is really the agreed upon texts and thinkers that have shaped a very geographically small interpretation of what God means.
Right, yeah. That's true.
And that's not to criticize it too much. I mean, you can't consider everything, but if you're going to talk about the attributes of God, you've got to kind of fess up and say, look, this is a very narrow interpretation, but it's interesting nonetheless.
I mean, you have to be fair to the course in that it's a 2-year course. So you can discuss a lot in a 2-year course, but you can't discuss everything, because philosophy as a subject goes back thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, with those kind of provisos in mind, and who gets to decide who's in the canon and who isn't, look, set those issues aside for now. There's a curriculum, there's an A-level course, there are definitions of what God is. Let's stick to that, and let's see if we can have an interesting chat.
And the quick disclaimer I'm going to put out is a bit about terminology, and I'm going to try and not slip up myself here, but a lot of people refer to God as He, which is kind of an issue that comes back from the New Testament referring to God as the Father, but in reality God isn't gendered, so I'm going to try and refer to God as God or as they, but I just want to apologise if I slip up and say He at any point.
Yeah, you know what, that's prudent actually, and that's and I mean, if you want to talk about who gets into the canon and who doesn't, it is very much a a white male dominated space. So that's part of the limitation and the problem of the resources that we've cut ourselves off from in this discussion. But we are not the ones who get to ascribe the A-level curriculum. We're only here to try and pour through it and see if we can get some value out of it.
Exactly, yeah, that sums it up perfectly, yeah.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. No, that's a really good call, Ryan. I wonder, was I that wise when I was your age? I hope that doesn't sound condescending, but that's a really good call. So, shall we move on to talking about the meat of the issue?
100%, I think we should. Yeah, that's a great call.
Okay, so let's talk very quickly. In the next episode, we're going to talk in more detail about what the definition of the attributes are and some of the challenges to them and some of the responses to the challenges. But before we do that, Ryan, do you fancy taking on the job of creating a god?
Sure, why not? It sounds like a fun journey.
Okay, why not? You know, it's a Monday night. Actually, sorry, it's a Sunday night, appropriate for the day that's in it. So, right, we're going to build a god. So, if we are building a god, I personally don't see the point of making a small god. So, I think we should make a capital G god.
Yeah.
And if we're trying to make a god, then in terms of, let's say, what are the categories that we care about? Probably, similar to people. So, what do we admire in people? We admire intelligence in people.
We admire goodness in people.
Yeah, exactly. And we admire, Trump is a great example of this. We admire strength, or at least the projection of strength. So
right.
If we were going to go ahead and try and build this god that kind of reflects the things that we admire, is he going to be clever, or is he going to literally know every possible thing?
I'd say know every possible thing. We're taking it to the extreme. He's the most powerful being, so of course he knows every possible thing.
Right, so attribute number 1, he knows absolutely everything there is possible to know. What else did we say? We said he was good. Right, so is he a little bit good?
No, he's extremely good. He's as good can be.
Yeah, he's as good can be. I couldn't have put it better myself, right? And powerful. If we're going to build a god, we should probably make him like extraordinarily powerful, like as Superman times 100, right? So there's nothing he
unlimited power.
Unlimited power. That's a great way to phrase it. Unlimited power, right? So, and if we wanted to talk a little bit about ontology, would it be better that if we're trying to make the best thing ever, is something that exists better than something that is just imaginary that you just made up?
No, it's better. I'd rather have ice cream than think about ice cream. So I'd rather God existed.
Right, you'd rather the thing has existence rather than it's just something in your head, right? So you'd rather have an actual ice cream you can lick and eat and enjoy than a kind of a one in your head that you can imagine.
Yeah, the idea of ice cream isn't as appealing as actual ice cream.
Absolutely. So, taking all these things together, we have, he's extraordinarily clever. Amazingly clever. So that's omniscience is the term or the attribute. He's extraordinarily powerful. So that is omnipotence, right? He can literally do anything. He's also extremely kind. He's not one of these malicious, evil people, small-minded, petty. He's a kind, extraordinarily kind being, full of love, and that is omnibenevolence, to give it its term. And we've skipped a little bit into what you call ontology, which is the kind of nature of this being. We've also said that, look, a God that exists is better than one that you've just made up in your head. So existence is a kind of a supreme quality as well.
Yeah, so our God is extremely good, extremely kind, unlimited knowledge, and he's real. He has to exist.
Yeah, because otherwise he'd be less than perfect.
Exactly. Yeah.
But to kick off, we have omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. Those are the 3 attributes that the A-level curriculum highlights and wants us to explore. So just before we get into attributes themselves, 2 kind of very quick definitions, because these words appear a lot in the A-level spec and in philosophy. And if you're just new to philosophy, which this podcast is really for people who are kind of coming into it for the first time, they can be a bit intimidating, a little bit abstract. So With your permission, just a quick word or two on what metaphysics is and what ontology is.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think if we're going to do some definitions, we could also discuss the definition of concept and proposition as well right now, just get that out of the way.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, look, why don't I take metaphysics and ontology, you can do concept and proposition, and then we'll meet back up to do definitions.
Sounds great.
Okay, so the A-level spec talks about epistemology, moral philosophy, metaphysics of God, and metaphysics of mind. So metaphysics, just to try and make it less obscure and bizarre. Metaphysics is basically the science of things that transcend what is physical or natural. So metaphysics is any discussion about things that are beyond the merely physical. So meta being beyond, physics being physical. So you can see immediately that the metaphysics of God is going to be an interesting topic, because God falls into that category of being beyond just the physical, beyond a material object. So any discussion of God is necessarily a metaphysical discussion. That's all metaphysics means, a chat about something that you can't touch.
And how about ontology?
So ontology is the study of metaphysics that deals with the nature of being, right? So the nature of being is extraordinarily abstract and quite intimidating. And, for people like Heidegger, it's a life's work. But simply put, ontology just means what type of being is the thing that we're talking about. So now we're talking about God. What type of being is it? What can we say about this God thing? It's very obvious that the being of something like Mickey Mouse is going to be different than the being of a person like you or me. We're not the same category of thing, but we both in some sense exist. So ontology is the job of teasing out what it means to be Mickey Mouse and what it means to be, well, you or I, Ryan. So just to get that out there, because they're quite intimidating words and they do crop up a bit on the spec.
Yeah, no, the other ones are concept. So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's definition of concept is the building blocks of thought. So effectively what that means is, if I was to say cat and a French person was to say le chat, we're using different words but we're expressing the same concept. So the concept is the idea in your head behind the words you're saying. So we use the words to express the concepts. And then a proposition is, if we say concept to the building blocks, propositions are what we build with those blocks. Propositions are true or false. If I was to say the cat is blue, that's a proposition. If I was to say, is the cat blue, that wouldn't be a proposition because it's a question. And questions aren't true or false.
Got you. Yeah, no, that's helpful to get that kind of out of the way. Because if you haven't got those things in your back pocket, it can be quite intimidating what we get into in the next slide. So should we talk about omnipotence, Ryan? Are we ready to talk about superpowers? Sorry, I should probably disclose, just in the interest of intellectual honesty and integrity, I'm an atheist, so my discussions of God will probably come across a little bit irreverent if you're a believer, but I do try and take the philosophy behind it seriously. The arguments and the counter-arguments and the thought and writing is sincere and powerful and intellectually persuasive. It's just not the camp that I'm in, so I find it fascinating and powerful, but ultimately it's not from my disposition, let's say.
Right, and I'll also say now as well that I'm also an atheist, but I'm going to try not to be biased at all, because the philosophy behind it, again, is really interesting, and it's nice to look at both sides of the argument.
Yeah, absolutely. So omnipotence is from the Latin omnipotentia or omnipotens, which is the ability to do all things. So God has the ability to do all things. It's one of the attributes, one of the things we know about him. And what evidence do we have to support that? So it's a good starting question. According to the Bible, he created the world. He can grant life after death. He knows everybody's innermost thoughts. He ultimately decides, who is saved and who is damned. He can control all facets of nature, space, and time. He can communicate with anybody at any time. And also, God's omnipotence is one of the defining characteristics that separates him from many other gods in perhaps the time of Aristotle or Plato. So in pantheistic religions, you didn't have this central localization of total power in a single monotheistic entity, and so that makes God historically quite an interesting idea and an interesting character, that he has all power located in just the one person or one thing.
Yeah, no, 100%. So the brief kind of quick way of defining that would be omnipotence would be God is able to perform all tasks. That's just how you'd quickly shorthand that.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Right, so let's try and talk a little bit about teasing out what we mean by doing all the tasks, or doing all the things, or having all the power. So as a syllogism, you might write it out very simply like this. You might say, premise 1, X is omnipotent if X has the power to do anything. Premise 2, God has the power to do anything. Conclusion, God is omnipotent, right? So it's a nice, simple, definitional syllogism there, okay? So, if we were to try and undermine or interrogate this idea of omnipotence, we'd probably focus on what on earth we mean by the power to do anything. And that brings us into, because simply put, if you can prove that there's something that God can't do, then you can prove that he's not omnipotent. So that's the thinking here. So if you wanted to interrogate or call into question this definition or attribute of God, you would go about it saying, look, if I can find something that God can't do, it means he's not actually all-powerful, which means who knows if his claims of other powers are legitimate or otherwise. And again, we're falling into that language of calling God a he, and apologies for that in advance. So does that make sense to you, Ryan? If you wanted to interrogate omnipotence, you'd want to try and find something that can't be done by this God.
Exactly, yeah. If you wanted to find an issue with the term omnipotence, you would want to say God can't do this. And we'll get into that a bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. Well then, let's move swiftly on to omniscience. So omniscience, omniscientia from the Latin, basically literally means all-knowing or knowing all things. Knowing everything that perhaps it's possible to know. There is no fact or possible state of affairs in the past, present, future that God does not know, which would make him an excellent addition to a pub quiz team or your local raffle, whatever it is. So he knows literally every fact. That's what we mean when we say omniscience.
And yeah, so I'd define it by saying God knows all true propositions, and that's where the term proposition is important, because there are propositions about the past, the present, and the future. So I could say Steve went to the shops is a proposition about the past. I could say Steve is eating an apple. That's a proposition about right now. So God knows all true propositions.
Okay, very good. And then omnibenevolence from the Latin omni bene volence, which is all good will. So he is a supremely moral being. He is the highest of goods, the eternal love, the alpha and the omega of compassion. That is the attribute that has been ascribed to God, and one of the common refrains is that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So what evidence do we have that God is loving and kind and charitable? He sacrificed his only son to redeem mankind, and there is no more selfless and kind act than to do that. So it is an omnibenevolent entity that we're dealing with. Yeah.
Basically, omnibenevolence just means God can't do anything morally wrong.
Yes. Yeah. To be teased out, but yeah. That's a good way to start. Absolutely.
So those are the definitions, shorthand definitions for the three divine attributes of God.
Yep.
The next thing to do is to attack them effectively.
Yes, well, interrogate them to try and discover if they're true and if they're sensible and if they are compelling.
Yeah, definitely. That was a really good conversation. Thank you.
All right, cheers, Ryan. Looking forward to hashing through the rest of it with you.
Yeah, so next time we're going to be going into more depth about the definitions, and then we're going to look at some arguments against the definitions and the problems there.
Yeah, and some responses to those arguments, because you know, it's extraordinary how clever and how resourceful philosophical thinkers are at answering these problems they tie themselves up in. So should be fun.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you, mate. That was a really good talk.
Cheers, Ryan. Talk to you soon.
Thank you all for listening to the first episode of The Things You Thought You Knew. I want to again thank Dan for agreeing to be on the podcast. I've spent a few months now trying to organise it and get it all together, and I'm so glad to finally see it coming to life. You can follow us on Instagram at The Things You Thought You Knew, or on Twitter at You Thought You Knew, and we've got a Facebook page called, you guessed it, The Things We Thought You Knew. The cover art for this podcast was done by Grace Bulchin, who you can find on Instagram at jinxart, jinx.artx. If you're interested in appearing on the podcast, just contact us on any of the above social medias. Next week, I'm going to be joined again by Dan to discuss arguments for the incoherence and the concept of God. I hope you're all staying safe out there. Have a good one.